They say history remembers queens, their crowns, their portraits, their graves. But what happens when a queen is buried with no ceremony, no coffin, and no name carved into stone? What happens when even her bones are scorched with quicklime, as if the earth itself was commanded to forget her? Katherine Howard was once Queen of England, wife to the most powerful king the country had ever known. And yet, to this day, no one can say with certainty where her body lies, or whether anything of her remains at all. She arrived at court as a teenager, full of laughter, music, and naïve charm, brought there by her powerful uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, a man whose ambition reached as far as the crown itself. But Katherine was no chess master. She was a pawn, placed in proximity to a king in decline, a man who had already married 4 women, executed 2 of them, and grown increasingly paranoid and cruel with each passing year. Henry, the once dashing monarch who broke from Rome for Anne Boleyn, had by then become bloated, bitter, and deeply wounded by personal failures. But still, when his tired eyes fell on young Katherine, he saw in her a chance to recapture something lost his youth. His pride, perhaps even his manhood. She was described as the jewel of womanhood, a flower in full bloom, radiant with joy and innocence. But innocence was not the same as safety. When Henry chose her, there was no refusal. On the same day, his trusted advisor Thomas Cromwell was dragged to the scaffold and beheaded. Henry married his 5th queen, Katherine Howard. 1 crown was lifted, 1 head was taken. That was the nature of power under Henry's rule fast, final, and soaked in blood. But Katherine was not a queen carved from the same cold stone as her cousin Anne Boleyn. She was light-hearted, uneducated in statecraft, and too young to understand the walls closing in around her. While Henry celebrated their union with banquets and gifts, Katherine found herself drawn into secret meetings, whispered promises, and letters that should never have been written. Her past began to resurface, and with it, names that would later be etched into the records of treason. Francis Dereham, the man she may have once loved before the king, Thomas Culpeper, the courtier who would later be the death of her, and Jane Boleyn, the lady-in-waiting who watched, arranged, and betrayed. The court is a place of silence and sound, of whispers that travel faster than truth. And it was in those shadows that the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, uncovered the first letter, a letter in Katherine's own hand, addressed to Culpeper, filled with the language of longing and affection. It was enough to end her, enough to break the heart of a tyrant king, or ignite his fury. As Henry knelt in prayer at Hampton Court, he was informed of his young wife's alleged infidelity. The man who had loved her as a jewel now saw her as a dagger in his back. She was stripped of her title, her chambers sealed, her allies arrested. Thomas Culpeper and Francis Dereham were tortured, tried, and executed, their heads placed on spikes above London Bridge, as warnings to all who would dare touch the king's possession.
I die a queen, but would rather die the wife of Culpeper.
And then came Katherine, a girl of no more than 19, escorted by boat under those very same heads, gliding silently down the Thames towards the Tower of London, where her cousin Anne Boleyn had also met her fate. Inside the tower, she waited, alone. They say she spent her final night practicing how to lay her head upon the block, so that the executioner might not miss, so that the death would be clean, swift. Without need for a second blow, no one came to pray with her. No priest was summoned to offer comfort. She was no longer a queen. She was simply a prisoner, awaiting the morning. And when the sun rose on the 13th day of February, in the year 1542, the scaffold was prepared in the courtyard. There were no hymns sung, no bells rang. Only a handful of witnesses stood in the cold as she climbed the steps. Dressed in the plain clothes of the condemned, she knelt. She spoke her final words. Some say she claimed she deserved to die 1,000 deaths for betraying the king, though no one can confirm what was truly said. And then, in one clean stroke of the axe, her head was taken. But death was not the end of Katherine Howard's erasure. Her body was not placed in a coffin. There was no royal procession, no gravestone. She was wrapped in cloth, her severed head beside her, and lowered into a shallow grave beneath the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. Within the walls of the tower, the king ordered quicklime. Poured upon her remains a substance so corrosive it could destroy bone, skin, identity. It was said to aid in decomposition. In truth, it aided in disappearance. Henry did not want to remember her. He did not want anyone to remember her. Years later, during Queen Victoria's restoration of the chapel, workers unearthed bones. They found remains that could be identified. Anne Boleyn, Lady Jane Rochford. Others whose deaths were public and known. But Katherine, her skeleton was never found. Only a small cluster of bones, badly damaged by lime, near the high altar, possibly hers. Possibly not. No DNA tests were ever done. No official confirmation made. In the end, even science could not undo what Henry had done. Today, there is a stone in the chapel floor. It bears Katherine's name. But beneath it, there is no certainty, no proof that she rests there. Some believe the stone is symbolic, a placeholder for a girl who was never given a grave. A girl who was married to a monster, and then punished for trying to find affection elsewhere. A girl who was used, discarded, and then scrubbed from memory. This is not just the story of a beheading. It is the story of deliberate forgetting, of a king who, in his rage and power, sought to erase not just a person, but a presence, and in doing so, he created one of the most haunting silences in all of English history. She was a girl born into a name that meant little, unless whispered beside a powerful man. Katherine Howard's lineage was noble. Yes, but worn thin by scandal and debt. Her father, Edmund Howard, was brother to the formidable Duke of Norfolk. But he had squandered opportunities, married poorly in the eyes of court society, and spent most of his life in quiet disgrace. Katherine's mother died when she was still a child, and what little security the girl knew slipped away with her. In a time when noble girls were bartered for status or silenced in shadowed corridors, Katherine was sent to the household of her step-grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, to be raised among a cluster of other half-watched noble daughters. There, among the dormitories, and whispered giggles of adolescence, the story began. But this story was no fairy tale. It was not about a girl plucked from obscurity and elevated to glory. It was about a girl barely educated, raised in chaos, who danced at the edges of propriety and never truly understood the stage she was being placed upon. In that household, rules were loose, supervision was lacking, and there were men older, watching, waiting. One of them was Francis Derham, a secretary with charm and dark eyes, who took advantage of the young Katherine's isolation, whether she loved him or merely yielded out of fear or loneliness. History does not know for certain. What is known is that they shared a relationship intimate, complicated, and damning. Years later, that teenage indiscretion would be called treason. But for now, Katherine was simply another girl at court, one among many in the household of Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. The marriage had been a political contract gone sour. Henry detested Anne from the moment they met, finding her unattractive and foreign, calling her the Flanders mare behind her back. He grew cold, petulant, angry, but he noticed Katherine, fresh-faced, playful, soft-voiced. She was everything. Anne was not. And in a court built on appearances and alliances, that was enough. The old king, swollen with years and leg wounds that stank beneath bandages, watched her with a hunger that had little to do with love. He saw her as a balm, a prize, a renewal. What could Catherine have thought? Could she have imagined that flirtations exchanged in the Queen's chamber would land her in the King's bed? Could she have said no? Would she have dared, for all her youth and laughter? Catherine was not a fool. She must have understood what the King's gaze meant. She must have heard the murmurs of her family, who saw in her the chance to regain influence at court. The Howards were hungry. They had watched Anne Boleyn rise and fall, and they knew the price of ambition. Still, they pushed her forward, and Catherine, perhaps dazzled, perhaps terrified, stepped into the role expected of her. Henry was nearly 50. He was tired, volatile, unpredictable, but he gave her jewels, gowns, attention. He called her his rose without a thorn, paraded her through the palace, and bathed her in declarations of affection that masked something darker possession. He wanted her youth to redeem his decay. He wanted her innocence to cleanse his past sins. And she, barely past girlhood, was placed on a throne of splinters. They were married on the 28th of July. The same day, Thomas Cromwell, the architect of Anne Boleyn's downfall and the King's longtime advisor, was beheaded on Tower Hill. One crown exchanged for another execution. Catherine's ascent was soaked in blood before she ever sat on the throne. In the early days, she played her part. She danced. She smiled. She did not speak out of turn. But Catherine was not made for the stillness of queenship. She was restless, spirited, perhaps even reckless. She had never been trained in diplomacy or the dangerous game of royal favour. She missed the companionship of people her age, longed for conversation and closeness. And the king, wrapped in silks and sickness, could not offer her that. So she began to seek it elsewhere. Among the courtiers, one man stood out. Thomas Culpeper, handsome, gallant, close to the king. Their interactions were observed, their meetings whispered about, and in the dusk-lit corners of the palace, where eyes could not follow, something bloomed between them. Was it love? Was it a foolish desire for freedom? Or was it, as some would later claim, manipulation and betrayal? The truth died with her. Still, the letters survived. Catherine, perhaps emboldened by secrecy, perhaps naive to the consequences, began to write to Culpeper, letters filled with longing, affection, hope. She may have believed they were safe, may have trusted too deeply, but the walls of the palace remember everything. And in time, those letters would become daggers pointed at her throat. She had married a monster. Yes, but not the kind with horns or claws. Henry was not grotesque in appearance. Not always. His monstrosity was deeper, more insidious. It was in the way he loved, and then destroyed. Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, Cromwell, so many others who had once stood close, only to be cast into ruin when their usefulness ran dry. Catherine did not yet understand that her greatest danger was not in her secrets being discovered. It was in Henry falling out of love, and when he did, the fall would be swift, merciless, and permanent. In the months after their marriage, the whispers grew. The letters were noticed. The names of Francis Derham and Thomas Culpeper began to circle through the court like vultures. Catherine may have felt the cold breath of suspicion against her neck, may have sensed that her days were numbered, but it was already too late. She had stepped into a story already written, and in that story, the girl always marries the monster, but she never survives him. There are places in palaces where secrets breed hidden alcoves behind embroidered tapestries, lantern-lit corridors, where footsteps echo too softly, and gardens shadowed just enough by ivy and dusk to invite confession. In such spaces, whispers become currency. They float like dust through the air, unseen yet inescapable, brushing against robes and lingering on the lips of servants, pages, and ladies in waiting. And in the royal courts of Tudor England, no whisper went unheard for long. Katherine Howard, Queen of England in name, child in truth, lived among those whispers. She had been lifted onto a throne still slick with the blood of Anne Boleyn, and although the crown sat lightly on her golden head, its weight crushed something deeper inside her, the last remnants of freedom, of identity, of choice. In the court's eyes, she was beautiful, dutiful, and dangerously unguarded. She had entered marriage with a monster, but it was the whispers she carried with her that would awaken the beast. Before the wedding, before the jewels and processions, there had been Francis Derham, a man whose name would one day ring like a bell of doom through the halls of Whitehall. Francis had been close to Catherine during her teenage years at Lambeth, in the lax household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. There, amid neglected studies and unchecked behaviour, the lines between flirtation and fate blurred. Francis was no noble knight or royal courtier. He was a household secretary. But he held influence over the girls. And Catherine, lonely, unwatched, and inexperienced, was drawn to him. Whether their relationship was one of love, coercion, or survival remains debated by historians. But what cannot be doubted is that it left a mark, both emotional and damning. Whispers of their intimacy were not confined to the past. They followed Catherine like a shadow to court, crawling beneath the hems of her new gowns, echoing in the ears of jealous courtiers and political enemies. And once she became queen, those whispers became louder, more dangerous. Francis, perhaps emboldened by his prior claim, reappeared in her orbit. Whether summoned or opportunistic, he sought a place in her household and referred to her fatally as his contracted wife. His arrogance, or his foolishness, would become the first crack in the glass image of the perfect queen. But it was not Francis Derham who the queen's heart began to beat for again. It was another, far more reckless affection that would lead to her destruction. Thomas Culpeper was not a stranger to the king. He had been one of Henry's most favoured gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, a man allowed into the most intimate royal spaces, trusted to dress the king, to carry his messages, to witness him in sickness and rage. Handsome, well-spoken, and ambitious, Culpeper moved through court like a flame, and women watched him from behind fans with eyes full of mischief and danger. Catherine watched too, and soon she did more than watch. How it began, how it truly began, no one can say. Some believe it was Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of Anne Boleyn's brother George, who arranged the first meeting. Others say Catherine initiated the affair herself, desperate for connection, for a life beyond the cold. Ceremonial existence of being wife to a man twice her age with festering ulcers and a short temper. Perhaps they met by chance, by accident, and in that accident found a spark neither could extinguish. What is known is this: they began to meet, quietly, repeatedly. Jane Boleyn, already broken by her own tragedies, and perhaps haunted by the execution of her husband and sister-in-law, became the go-between. She arranged the times, the places, the excuses. Catherine and Thomas met in the Queen's private chambers, in the dead of night, when even the torch flames seemed to flicker in hesitation. The Queen's ladies were either loyal or fearful enough to keep silent for a time. And then there were the letters. Catherine, ever the romantic, ever the child within a woman's role, wrote to Culpeper with a vulnerability that history rarely records. Her words spoke of longing, of devotion, of fear and hope braided together. She addressed him with warmth, with pleading, with the kind of love one would not expect from a queen, but from a girl who had never been taught the rules of survival in a palace of knives. One letter, in particular, would survive to doom her. In it, she wrote, "Yours as long as life endures." That single line, pressed in ink on parchment, folded with care, and delivered by a hand that thought itself invisible, would later be read aloud, not in love, but in judgment, a promise between lovers turned to a confession before a court. It was Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, who became the collector of whispers. He had his own reasons: loyalty to the king, fear for the realm, perhaps even a desire to prevent scandal before it shattered the already fragile crown. He was the one who found the letter, the one who confronted Catherine while the king was away, the one who carefully, methodically peeled back the layers of secrecy that surrounded her. At first, she denied everything. She was terrified, cornered, confused. But when Cranmer produced the evidence letters, testimony, rumours bound together into a noose, she faltered. She admitted to knowing Francis Derham before her marriage, confessed that they had called each other husband and wife. But of Culpeper, she said less. She insisted nothing improper had happened, that they only met to talk, that her heart was innocent, even if her timekeeping was not. But Henry, the king who had once called her his rose without a thorn, was not a man inclined toward mercy. When he was told when the full weight of her betrayal was brought before him, he reportedly collapsed in grief and fury. Some claimed he wept. Others said he raged like a wounded beast. Whether he mourned the girl or mourned his pride, only he knew. But the sentence was clear before the trial began. Culpeper and Derham were arrested, tortured, and tried. Derham, deemed guilty of presuming to marry the Queen before the king, was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a death reserved for traitors of the lowest kind. Culpeper, having been a favourite of the king, was granted the mercy of a simple beheading. Jane Boleyn, the ever-silent accomplice, was imprisoned, her mind unravelling by the day. And Catherine, she was taken to Sion Abbey first, held under watch. While the court decided how a queen becomes a prisoner, it was said she spent her days in prayer, in denial, in dread. She asked to speak with the king, to plead her case, to explain, but he refused to see her. To him, she no longer existed. She was not his queen. She was not even his wife. She was merely a problem to be removed. The court pronounced her guilty of treason, and a date was set. But before the execution, before the cold block and the final breath, there was still the silence. That cruel, stretching silence of those final nights, when Catherine must have lain awake, listening to the sounds of a world that was preparing to forget her. She had written letters in hope. The world would now write her name in ash. There is a moment in every storm when the air changes, when the wind stops playing and begins to tear, when the sky, once soft with warning, turns to lead and presses down on everything that dares to breathe beneath it. For Katherine Howard, that moment came not with a shout, not with a soldier's grip or the clang of iron doors, but with a letter, a single parchment, folded once, then again, inked not with love, but with judgment, and the man who delivered it was no guard. He was a priest, a man of the cloth, cloaked in calmness and cunning. His name was Thomas Cranmer, and he came not to save her but to prepare her soul for ruin. The Archbishop of Canterbury had been many things in the court of King Henry: a reformer, a survivor, a man who had seen queens rise and queens fall, and who had learned painfully how to speak softly while the axe waited in the wings. Cranmer knew well the terrain of royal treason. He had navigated the trial of Anne Boleyn, seen Jane Seymour in childbirth, blessed Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, and watched that union dissolve with nothing more than a shrug and a signature. He was no stranger to the machinery of downfall, but when he turned his eyes to Catherine, there was something different in his gaze. Not pity, not reverence. Perhaps it was recognition. A man who knew she had no armor, and no understanding of the world that had been laid at her feet. It was the 2nd of November, a date forever etched into the bloodied margins of Catherine's story. Cranmer came to Hampton Court, where the King and Queen were staying, and placed the letter into Henry's hands. It contained allegations serious, salacious, and sickening to a monarch known for both jealousy and vengeance. It spoke of Catherine's past, with Francis Derham. Not rumours, not court gossip, but a direct statement from one Mary Lascelles, a former lady of the Dowager Duchess's household, who had known of Catherine's misbehaviour long before she wore a crown. Mary had warned her own brother not to become entangled with Catherine, claiming she was light in living a damning phrase in the Tudor world, where a queen's virtue was supposed to be unquestionable, untouchable, and above all, untouched. The king did not react at once. He did not storm into Catherine's rooms or demand her arrest. Instead, he ordered an investigation. Quiet, methodical, lethal. He sent Cranmer, with all the authority of God and the throne, to confront the girl who had once been the light in his dimming world. And so Cranmer walked the halls with silent steps, bearing the words that would unravel everything. When he entered her chamber, Catherine greeted him with politeness, perhaps even curiosity. She could not yet have known what he carried. When he explained that he had come to question her, she turned pale. When he read aloud the accusations, her voice at first defensive began to crack. She denied them. Of course she did. She denied knowing Derham intimately, denied calling him husband, denied any wrongdoing. But Cranmer, ever a percentage, left her with the knowledge that the truth or something resembling it was already slipping through the cracks beneath her. He returned the next day, and the next, slowly, piece by piece. Her story began to crumble. She admitted to past familiarity with Derham, admitted he had called her his wife, that they had referred to each other with the language of betrothal. But still, she insisted it had all occurred before her marriage to the king, and therefore could not be considered treason. It was a plea not for mercy, but for technicality. In her mind, perhaps, she believed that honesty would save her, that a confession, delivered humbly, would open the door back into Henry's affections. But there was another name waiting in the shadows: Thomas Culpeper. The Queen's nighttime meetings, the secret visits arranged by Jane Boleyn, the letters, one of which had now found its way into Cranmer's possession, its words clinging like thorns to the fabric of royal dignity. Yours, as long as life endures. That line was no longer sweet. It was an admission, and it could not be explained away as youthful foolishness. Under interrogation, Culpeper confessed to having meetings with the Queen. Though he stopped short of admitting to adultery, he claimed nothing physical had taken place. But the implication was enough. Derham, dragged into the web, admitted that Catherine had replaced him with Culpeper, and when the pieces were presented to the king, laid before him like a shattered mirror, Henry collapsed. The king's grief, if it was grief, was monstrous. Some said he locked himself away in his chambers, refusing food and comfort, that he wept, tore at his clothing, raged against the very air for betraying him. Others whispered that his sorrow was rooted not in love, but in pride, that he had once again been made a cuckold before the eyes of Europe. A king who could not command the loyalty of his own wife was a man unfit to command armies. His heart may have broken, or perhaps only his ego. For Catherine, the collapse was more physical. She was placed under guard, stripped of her jewels, her attendants, her dignity. The once celebrated queen now wore the robes of a prisoner. Her fate no longer her own. She was moved from Hampton Court to Sion Abbey, a place of silence and solitude, where the nuns prayed in rhythms that seemed to ignore the storms outside their cloister. There, Katherine waited, day after day, uncertain whether the next knock at her door would be the one to summon her to trial or to the block. She begged for an audience with the king, wrote letters disparate, pleading, full of the same youthful hope that had once made her believe she could find love within a marriage built on fear. But Henry refused to see her. Not once did he allow her back into his presence. Her voice, once the sweet sound that made him feel young again, was now something he could not bear to hear. The court moved swiftly. As it always did when blood was expected, a bill of attainder was drawn up, declaring Katherine guilty of treason without trial. The charge adultery committed as queen, a crime punishable by death. Parliament passed it with ease. There were no defenders, no lawyers, no appeals. A queen had become a traitor, and traitors died. But before she died, she waited. At the Tower of London, her rooms were cold. The air tasted of stone and iron. Time moved strangely there sometimes, so slow that she could feel every breath, sometimes so fast that entire days disappeared in the fog of grief. They say she wandered her chamber at night, whispering prayers she barely remembered, practicing how to kneel, how to hold still, how to place her neck upon the block without trembling. She had heard the stories. She knew what happened when the axe missed. Katherine Howard was 19 years old. By the time the order for her execution was signed, she was no longer a girl. Not really. The fear had aged her. The silence had hollowed her out. Her hair, once soft and brushed with oils, hung limp. Her hands, once adorned with rings, were bare. Her voice, once musical, was now too quiet to carry beyond the stone walls. She had confessed. She had cried. She had begged. And still, the block waited. The river was still that morning, and the oars moved through it with a rhythm too gentle to match the horror of the task they carried out. The barge drifted quietly beneath a low, ash-coloured sky. The passengers silent, their faces turned away from the chill that crept up the water like a living thing. A single figure sat in the centre of the boat, wrapped in plain wool, her face pale but composed. She was not crying. She did not scream. She did not ask them to turn back. Katherine Howard, former Queen of England, was being rowed toward her grave. The Tower of London had awaited her with a patience that only old stones can understand. It had known queens before her queens, who had walked through its gates as wives and had left it only as memories. Anne Boleyn had come this way, too. Just a few years earlier. Same river, same gate, same fate. The arch they passed beneath was called Traitor's Gate, and as Catherine's boat slipped into its shadow, it was said she looked up not in defiance, but in resignation, as though she had finally arrived where her story was always meant to end. It had been only a few months since she wore the crown, since she walked through Hampton Court's long halls with silks whispering at her heels and ladies trailing behind her, their mouths full of praise and envy. And now she was alone. No retinue, no court. Just the men who had been ordered to keep her breathing until someone else ordered them not to. The tower was quiet in February. The cold had chased away the birds. And the snow, though light, had settled between the stones like ash. The guards who took her did not speak more than necessary. There was nothing left to say. She was led through the inner gates, past the scaffold where others had met their end, and into the rooms prepared for her. Rooms not of comfort, but of containment. A queen turned prisoner does not sleep where royals rest. She sleeps behind iron, where the hours scratch slowly across the walls. Her chamber was bare. No candles, no flowers, no writing desk. A single blanket on a low bed, a single chair, and a window too high to reach. She spent her first night sitting upright, listening. For what? Even she could not say. Perhaps she hoped for the sound of footsteps bringing news that this had all been a mistake, that the king had changed his mind, that anyone had spoken for her. But no one did. The tower had long been a place where hope went to die. It held echoes of moans and final prayers, of men who once ruled armies and women who once ruled hearts. And now, in one of its shadowed corners, it held a teenage girl who had danced too freely, who had trusted too easily, who had fallen in love with the wrong man. Or perhaps not love. Perhaps it was only the need to feel wanted by someone who did not smell of rot and resentment. Someone who did not see her as a symbol, but as a soul. In the days that followed, her body began to move differently. Slower, heavier. She stopped trying to keep her hair neat. She stopped asking for mirrors. Her hands trembled in the mornings, and by night they went numb. But her mind remained alert. She remembered the dates. She remembered the names. She remembered the sounds of her own laughter in younger years, and how it had once echoed in the gardens of the Dowager Duchess's household. Before any of this had begun, it was said that Catherine spent hours kneeling in prayer. Though no priest came to offer absolution, she was allowed no confessor, no spiritual guide, only her thoughts, only her memories. She rehearsed her death in her mind, not because she was morbid, but because she was practical. Anne Boleyn had once asked that the swordman from Calais be swift, but Catherine had no such sword, only the axe, and the axe could be cruel. So she practiced how to kneel, how to place her neck, just so, how to breathe one last time without letting the fear rise too far into her throat. She did not want to be remembered for screaming. She wanted, in those final moments, to be more than the girl the king had erased. She wanted to meet the end with dignity, even if no one would witness it with love. On the 12th of February, she was told the morning would be her last. She did not cry. She thanked the messenger. She asked for writing materials, but was denied. She asked for communion, but no priest was sent. That night, she slept only briefly, and in the early hours, she asked for the block to be brought to her chamber. And so it was, a simple wooden structure, worn and stained from years of use, a relic of death. It was placed before her, and with no audience, no witness beyond the silent guard at the door, Katherine Howard knelt. She laid her neck upon it. Once, twice, again, her breathing shallow, her lips moving in quiet rhythm. Perhaps in prayer, perhaps in preparation, the guard did not move. He simply watched, as a girl not yet 20 rehearsed her exit from the world. Alone. When morning came, the sky had not yet turned fully to light. The courtyard outside was silent, though a small crowd had gathered just enough to fulfill custom, but not enough to mark the moment. She was led out without ceremony. Her dress was plain. Her hair was uncovered. The scaffold was slick from frost, and the straw beneath it crackled beneath her step. No family waited. No priest stood beside her. Only the executioner, tall and still, his blade newly sharpened. She knelt again, this time for the last time, and though the words she spoke are debated, one phrase was remembered by more than one account. I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper. Whether she said it aloud or only whispered it to herself, the truth of it hung in the air like fog. She had been queen in name, but never in peace. The axe did not falter. One blow, clean, final. Her body slumped forward. Her head rolled, blood darkened the straw beneath her, and the crowd dispersed in silence, as though history itself had looked away. The tower, in its silence, did not react. It had seen it all before, and it would see it all again. But somewhere deep within its walls, a girl's shadow lingered longer than most. A girl who had once laughed too loud, trusted too quickly, and died too soon. The morning did not rise gently. It crept across the sky in a hush of grey and bone. Like a mourner who no longer believes in prayer, the Tower of London, that fortress of stone and sorrow, stood unmoved. Its walls had witnessed queens kneel before. Its gates had groaned open for traitors, lovers, poots, soldiers. But this morning, it would bear the weight of a girl who had once been called a rose without a thorn. And soon, she would be cut from the stem, with no bloom left behind. The wind on the 13th day of February blew low and sharp, curling around the scaffold like it had a memory of its own. The wood had been swept clean, the block wiped of dust, though not of history. The straw beneath it had been freshly laid. But no fragrance rose from it, only the knowledge of what it was there to catch. A small crowd waited in the courtyard, their collars turned against the wind, their breaths clouding like spectres. No one spoke loudly. This was not a day for spectacle. It was a day for silence. And then she came. Katherine Howard, 19 years old, and already used to the echo of betrayal, walked slowly from the Queen's house. She was draped in a dark woolen gown plain, without embroidery, stripped of every emblem that once declared her a monarch. No jewellery hung from her ears, no crown pressed against her brow. Only a white cap covered her hair, and her hands, once so often wrapped around courtly letters and secret promises, were bare. She held no crucifix. There was no priest beside her. They say she looked pale, but not weak, that her steps were careful, measured, like someone who had already walked this path in her mind 100 times. And she had knelt beside that practice block the night before, whispering to the darkness, learning where her neck must rest, how still she must be, how brave. And now, beneath the winter sky, she returned to that posture for the last time. The scaffold creaked beneath her weight. Though she was light as a shadow, the executioner stood a few feet away, unmoving. His axe gleamed not with ceremony, but with purpose. He had been chosen for his precision. Henry, for all his fury, did not wish for a messy end, just a quick one. An erasure. Katherine turned to face the crowd. There were no courtiers, no family, no friends, only the required witnesses. And yet she spoke not to them. Not really, but to something larger. A final act of courage from a girl whose life had been directed by men since the moment she first bled. Her words, as with Anne Boleyn's before her, have been debated. Some claim she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Others swore she spoke only of regret, that she begged forgiveness, that she admitted her guilt and accepted her fate. But the truth is likely simpler and more tragic, whatever she said. It was for no one to carry but her. The wind took it, the stones absorbed it. The axe did not wait for applause. She knelt. Her eyes did not close. And then, one sound, one swing. The blade did not falter. It came down with the full weight of history behind it. And in a single motion, Katherine Howard was severed from the world. Her body slumped forward as though her spirit had leapt ahead of it. Her head fell into the straw, rolling slightly before coming to rest in stillness. A ribbon of blood crept beneath the block and pooled along the edge of the platform. The morning, already cold, seemed to grow colder. No one wept. Or if they did, they turned away before their tears could be seen. The witnesses filed out without words. The guards returned to their posts. The executioner cleaned his blade, and the tower, indifferent and unyielding, resumed its vigil. There was no funeral, no psalm, no eulogy. Her body, headless, was wrapped in cloth and taken into the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, the same stone sanctuary that had claimed Anne Boleyn, Jane Grey, and so many others. But unlike Anne, Catherine's burial was hurried, rough, almost cruel. There was no coffin, no carved name, just a hole dug into the frozen earth beneath the chapel floor. Her remains were placed in it, and over them was poured quicklime, heavy, hot, and consuming. The king had given the order, quicklime, he said, to hasten the decay, to blot her out, to destroy even the memory of her bones. It would eat through the flesh, through the cloth, through the bone itself, until there was nothing left to remember. No relics, no remains, no trace. And so the rose was gone, not faded, not fallen, erased. In that morning's silence, something cruelly profound had happened. A girl had died, a queen had been unmade, and a kingdom, already bruised by too many betrayals, had chosen to forget. The tower, however, did not forget. Its stones kept the echo of her name. Its walls knew the rhythm of her footsteps, and somewhere deep within its foundations, beneath the weight of centuries, the blood she left behind still lingers in the stone. They say history is written by the victors, but Katherine Howard had no victory, and no pen to write her own ending, only a morning of blood, only a name chiseled, not in marble, but in silence. She had no monument, no carved angel to watch over her, no grave where mourners might kneel, no flowers, no name etched into stone, only the silence of the chapel, and the hiss of quicklime sinking into cloth and skin and bone. It was not enough for her to die. She had to disappear. That was the king's command. The execution had been swift, but what came after was slower, colder. The body, limp and headless, had been wrapped in cloth by silent hands, perhaps a guard, perhaps a servant who dared not speak. There was no priest to bless her, no prayer offered over the bundle that had once been a queen. They carried her through the stone corridors of the tower, as though she were a burden to be discarded, through the doors of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, past the quiet pews where no one sat, past the altar where other royals had knelt in glory. She did not pass through them as a queen. She entered as evidence. The grave was already open, a hole beneath the chapel floor, not wide, not deep.
No, please,
there was no casket to lower, no velvet to line the walls, no dignity left to honor. They laid her down in silence. Perhaps someone wept. If so, they did so in secret. She had been condemned as a traitor, a woman whose love letters had become knives, whose secrets had become crimes, whose name had become a stain. Then they brought the lime, quicklime white, corrosive, burning not with flame but with hunger. It was poured over her in heaps, hissing as it touched blood. It wrapped around her body like a second burial shroud. A cruel one. It consumed. That was the point. Henry wanted no tomb, no bonis, no relics, no future hands to uncover her and speak her name with sympathy. He wanted her to be unremembered, for her to vanish not only from court, but from history. And so the lime did its work. It burned through the cloth, through the flesh, through the soft cartilage of a teenage girl whose bones had not yet hardened. Her youth worked against her. The lime devoured the smaller pieces first, the fingers, the cheeks, the neck, then the larger, the pelvis, the spine, the skull. Day by day, layer by layer, she faded beneath the floor, erased by alchemy and vengeance. The men who had buried her left without a word. The floor was closed. The altar stood above her, cold and indifferent, and the king went on. Henry never spoke of her again. There was no court mourning, no official record of her burial. No anthem of sorrow played through the halls of Whitehall. She had existed, she had worn the crown, and now she was gone. Not just dead, but unacknowledged. A shadow in the royal lineage. A space between queens. Years passed. Kings died. Queens rose. England changed. And beneath the chapel floor, the lime did not sleep. For generations, the story of Katherine Howard was a whisper, tucked between heavier names. Anne Boleyn, who died in scandal, but whose body was given a place. Jane Seymour, who died in childbirth, and was buried with reverence. Even Anne of Cleves, the unwanted queen, was honoured in death. But Katherine, she remained unspoken. Her name was not carved into church stones. Her body was not catalogued by royal physicians. She was the queen who vanished beneath the altar. But stones remember what men forget. And so it was that, centuries later, the past stirred again. During the long reign of Queen Victoria, there came a movement not just to preserve the grandeur of England, but to restore its forgotten dead. The tower, worn by centuries, needed care. Its chapel had aged poorly. Cracks ran through the altar stones. The floor sagged. And so workers were called in to restore St. Peter ad Vincula, to lift the slabs and tend to the bones below. The project was meant to be respectful, thoughtful, but what they found beneath that chapel floor would haunt the men for years. There were bodies. Many. Some were known Anne Boleyn's, distinguishable by the high forehead and delicate jaw, which royal physicians recognized from records. Lady Jane Rochford, her presence confirmed by her proximity to George Boleyn. Even Margaret Pole, the Countess of Salisbury, who had died at 70, was found, her bones long and brittle, her skull cracked by the botched executioner's blows. But Katherine, they could not be sure. They searched near the high altar, the place where condemned nobles were often buried hastily, and there, near the bones of Margaret Pole, they found a small cluster of remains, fragile, fragmented, and scorched. The lime had done its work too well. These bones were soft, thin, incomplete. They had crumbled in the hand. They bore no markers. There was no ring, no rosary, no silk, no trace of name. Only a memory of a body once young. Could it be her? Some believed so. The position matched. The size matched. The conditioned destruction by lime matched. But there was no certainty. There was no DNA. No photographs. No technology to speak on behalf of the dead. Only instinct. History. And sorrow. And so, for lack of proof, she remained unclaimed. Today, there is a stone in the chapel. A simple marquee, one of many, placed in the floor during the Victorian Restoration. It bears her name, Katherine Howard, Queen Consort of Henry VIII. But it is not a grave. Beneath it, there may be nothing, or there may be someone else. Or perhaps, just perhaps, those broken, burned bones beneath Margaret Pole's shadow were hers. And she lies there still, forgotten by the crown that crowned her, remembered only by the silence that followed. The lime had tried to destroy her, but it failed, because stories, even when burned, have a way of surviving. They live in the breath of those who dare to speak them aloud again. They live in the doubt, in the search, in the refusal to forget. And Katherine Howard, for all that was taken from her, remains, if not in stone, then in memory, if not in relic, then in sorrow. The girl who was erased became the queen whose shadow refuses to leave. There are some doors that history closes so gently, you would think nothing tragic lay behind them. No screaming, no blood, no girl who once dared to love in the wrong direction. The door to Katherine Howard's story was shut that way without ceremony. without memorial, without grief. But it was not locked. The past, like water, always finds a way to seep through cracks. And though her body may be gone, though her bones may have dissolved into the earth like salt into tears, the story of Katherine Howard, Queen of England, child of misfortune, shadow of a crown, never stayed buried for long. She did not return. Of course, not in the way that others did. Anne Boleyn was restored in memory, debated by historians, turned into novels, songs, and films. Her tragedy was sharp, dramatic, and unforgettable. But Katherine, she was not so easily grasped. There were no famous paintings of her face, no speeches remembered, no child left behind to wear her name. And so she faded, not with thunder, but with hush. Like the final note of a song no one realized was playing, and yet she never truly vanished. Centuries passed. Monarchs came and went. The tower remained, still swallowing time and story in its thick grey walls. St. Peter ad Vincula stood quiet, with its floor of names and its belly full of broken bodies, and people began to ask again what happened to her. Where did they put her? Was the girl who died for love still beneath their feet? Or had the king succeeded in what he always wanted, to leave no trace? The question itself was her resurrection. When Queen Victoria ordered the restoration of the chapel, she did so, not just as a sovereign, but as a woman, one who felt the injustice of what had been done in that sacred place. The Victorians, for all their marble and mourning veils, believed in honouring the dead, even those who had been shamed, especially those. They peeled up the stones of the chapel floor with cautious reverence, careful not to disturb what could not be undone. And they found bones, many bones. Some were clear, marked by records, positions, injuries. Anna Boleyn, Margaret Pole, Lady Jane Rochford, the lost daughters of Tudor ambition. Their remains were identified and reburied with modest dignity. But then there were others, partial, scorched, nameless. Among them, a set so slight, so damaged by quicklime, that no certainty could be claimed, just an educated guess, a breath of possibility. Could this be her? No DNA test could confirm it. No journal survived with a sketch of her final resting place. All they had was context and sorrow. And so the name Katherine Howard was placed on a stone, not because they found her, but because they knew they might never. A concession, not a discovery. A placeholder for the truth that had already been lost. She became a memorial of absence. And absence has its own kind of presence. Tourists walk through the chapel today, their footsteps muffled on centuries-old stones. Some pause at her name, not knowing her story, only that she was young and beheaded. Others know more. They lower their voices when they read it, not because anyone told them to, but because some names carry weight, even when nothing is left behind. A name like Katherine Howard does not shout. It whispers. It lingers. It asks, what if? What if she had been born to a gentler age? What if she had never entered the court? What if she had lived long enough to grow out of the girlhood they used against her? She never returned to court, never returned to the king's thoughts, never returned to her home. But she returned in other ways, in questions, in novels, in whispered legends. Some say her ghost walks the halls of Hampton Court, barefoot and trembling, still pleading for the king to listen. Others claim they've heard her weeping in the tower, long after midnight, in the chamber where she spent her final days. It doesn't matter whether the stories are true. What matters is that they exist, that someone still tells them. Because the worst fate for a queen is not to be hated, it is to be forgotten. And Katherine was almost forgotten. Almost. She was the fifth wife. The second to be executed, the one with no children, no reforms, no armies. But she was also the one who, perhaps more than any other, reminds us of what power can do when wielded without mercy, of what happens when love is treated as treason, and girlhood as guilt. She reminds us that the crown is not a shield, that sometimes it is the blade. And so, she did not return, but neither did she vanish. Her story was not written in stone. It was written in blood and silence and lime. But still, it was written, and it is still being read. There are stories we are taught to forget. They slip through the cracks in the walls of old palaces, vanish beneath the stones of forgotten chapels, and drift like smoke from the pages of heavy books. These are the stories of girls who were never meant to grow old. Girls who entered history as queens but left it as ghosts. Girls like Katherine Howard. Tonight, let us sit quietly with her memory. Not with judgment, not with pity, but with gentleness. Let us close our eyes and imagine her not as she was at the scaffold, or beneath the lime, or behind the locked doors of the tower, but as she might have been, had the world been kinder. Perhaps she would have been a music teacher, or a poet, or a mother. Perhaps she would have lived in a cottage with ivy on the walls and laughter in the kitchen. Perhaps she would have fallen in love with someone who looked at her not as a prize or a danger, but simply as a person, a girl, with soft hands and a bright laugh and dreams that had nothing to do with crowns. But that is not the story she was given. Instead, she was written into the margins of a king's wrath, a page in a ledger of executions, a name added to the list of wives who had come and gone, like seasons beneath a storm. Her life was not lived, it was decided. By men, by politics, by hunger for power dressed up as concern for virtue. And yet she remains, not because of monuments, not because of royal decrees, but because memory, when whispered softly enough, becomes something holy. Katherine Howard may have been erased by the king, but she is remembered by those who read between the lines, who hear her footsteps echo through the tower, who see her name, unguarded, in the stone, who pause not because she was a queen, but because she was a girl who did not deserve to die. She reminds us that history is not only the tale of kings and battles, it is also the quiet tragedy of one girl kneeling alone, asking not for mercy, but to be remembered. She was not powerful. She was not perfect, but she was human, and for that alone, she deserves her place. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember her, not with sadness, but with stillness. Remember that she laughed once, that she wrote letters with trembling hands, that she danced in gardens before the tower ever knew her name, that she hoped, that she trusted, that she tried to love, and that even in her final hour, she practiced courage not for glory, but so that she might leave this world with a little of her own grace. Let that be the story we keep. Not the axe, not the line, but the girl.
No, please, I beg of you!
The charge of adultery.
We charge you, Katherine Howard, with the crime of adultery!
No, please.
I thought you would not come. And miss this moment with you. No, no, no!
Anne Boleyn, I come to you now. No, no! Let me go! Please, Your Majesty, I beg you, have mercy on me. Please, Your Majesty, have mercy on me.
And who's to find all this due to him that brings him to healing?
I die a queen, but would rather die the wife of Culpeper.